Okay, in this presentation, we're going to look at the role of miracles and the apologetic value of miracles, and we're going to look at some questions and objections to miracles. This was recorded at our Ratio Christi meeting last fall at The Ohio State University. Now, of course, there are many resources on this topic if you want to go deeper. An excellent resource is the book In Defense of Miracles here, a comprehensive case for God's actions in history. An introductory level book is Norman Geisler's book, Miracles in the Modern Mind. In the middle here, Craig Keener has a 2-volume set called The Credibility of the New Testament Accounts, a more comprehensive refutation of David Hume's work. And by the way, David Hume plays a huge role in how people approach miracles in the academic world, but John Ehrman here has written a book called Hume's Abject Failure, and almost all the arguments against miracles go back to Hume. And then Colin Brown's book, Miracles in the Critical Mind. So that is enough to get you started on the topic if you want to go deeper, and I hope you will get those resources. Just a quote here from Jeffrey Burton Russell in his book Exposing Myths About Christianity. He says, a non-miraculous Christianity is historically and philosophically not Christianity at all. Thomas Jefferson and other well-meaning people edited the Bible to take out the miracles or else to explain the miracles away in pseudo-scientific terms. Snipping miracles out of the Bible is like taking battles out of Beowulf or liberty out of the Declaration of Independence. And he goes on to talk a little bit more about Jefferson. But if you're not familiar with what Thomas Jefferson did, he basically grabbed a knife or a razor and began cutting up parts of the Bible in about 1804. He kept the words of Jesus and some of his deeds, but he cut out the miracles and any suggestion Jesus is God. Of course, the virgin birth is gone, and Jesus walking on water and raising Lazarus from the dead and multiplying loaves of fishes and things like that are all cut out of the Bible. So his version of the Bible ended on Jesus' burial on Good Friday. And of course, there's no resurrection, and his version is called The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth. Obviously, Jefferson was influenced by the intellectuals of the Enlightenment period. We'll talk more about that in a minute, who happened to scoff at the biblical stories of miracles, but he believed that the study of nature proved the existence of God. He believed no government had the right to impose any religion on any individual. So obviously, there was a relationship between Jefferson's view of the church and government and what he viewed about the Bible, the separation of church and state. So what happens when people reject the miracles in the New Testament? I do run into people that are kind of like Jefferson, where they say they like the teachings and the ethics of Jesus, but they just don't believe in the miracles in the Bible. Or sometimes they might say the miracles are simply symbolic, they didn't really happen. And of course, sometimes Jesus is just no different from Buddha, Gandhi, or any other religious teacher. He's just like another guru in the first century. So these are common sayings from people when they read the Bible and why they and what comes out when they start rejecting the miraculous in the Bible in the New Testament. Now, some people, when they hear the word miracles, they assume that equates to supernatural. There's no doubt about that. And that means in some people's minds, this can mean superstition, believing in things like ghosts and fairies, or it could be believing nothing different than magic or weird things like belief in Zeus or Thor or other gods. And of course, some people might say it's silly not to believe there's anything other than the natural world. I mean, how can you believe anything other than the fact that nature is all there is? And of course, many people expect God to show them a sign, and one of the most common objections to God's existence is that people think that God is, they demand God to show them a sign, and they think that this sign should be clear. If God wants people to really know him, he should reveal himself in an unmistakable way. And this happened in an episode of this happened in one of my experiences on campus, and it's written about Natasha Crane's book. But this student came to me and he said here that I would need to have unambiguous direct evidence. He said some people will use their explanation for God or existing as things we don't know, like arguments that everything is so fine-tuned, but he said that doesn't do much for me. And this is from a conversation I had with a student. He said this directly points to God. He said that he needs God to come down and speak to me directly. And if that did happen, he would then have to verify that he's not hallucinating. It has to be some direct evidence. And this was from a conversation I had with a student at The Ohio State University. It's written about Natasha Crane's book right here. And so the problem is the key is the amount and type of evidence they're looking for to believe. And in many cases, sometimes atheists will go round and round with you because they say there's no evidence for God, and then you offer them evidence and they say that's not really evidence, and it ends up being like a circular argument, as we see right here. And unfortunately, that leads to all kinds of problems because sometimes skeptics think they can be the ones that demand what kind of evidence they want, and then the burden of proof's on you to provide that perfect evidence for them, and then if you don't, by their standard, it's not really evidence at all. Another common claim or common saying in the culture is extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And the syllogism kind of goes like this: extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The claim that any miracle such as the resurrection is extraordinary. Therefore, any evidence supporting it ought to be extraordinary as well. But most people who say this, in my experience, are not really sure what they mean by extraordinary. But they do know whatever evidence you attempt to come up with, it's not going to convince them. Therefore, they never have any good reasons or justification for believing Jesus rose from the dead. The problem with that, of course, is that you have to define the word extraordinary because they're equivocating on the word extraordinary. And also, once again, in many cases, we know that no amount of evidence will convince them because they're rejecting any kind of historical evidence that's available. Now, the purpose of God's actions in human history, as we see in the Bible, the way miracles are laid out, a sign is given, a miracle is done, knowledge of God is imparted to the individual, and then the response should be obedience or yielding over to God. It should be active participation in God's plan for humanity. So miracles are not given simply for entertainment, as we'll see in a minute. William Lane Craig talks about, he remembers that when he was looking at the evidence for God and how he viewed miracles on his journey to faith, he said the virgin birth was a stumbling block to him coming to faith. He said he simply could not believe such a thing. But then when he began to look at the cosmological evidence and the argument that God created the universe versus it coming to existence on its own or nature doing it on its own, he said it would not be too difficult for God to make a woman pregnant. He says once the non-Christian understands who God is, and the problem of miracles should cease to be a problem for him. Of course, that's according to William Lane Craig's arguments and life experience. Some people may agree or disagree, but that's what happened in his journey. Now, there was a well-known atheist named Anthony Flew. He actually came to faith later on in his life in some sort of God or a personal or a deity of some kind. Might just be a deistic God, but he said in one of his main objections was a miracle must be identifiable before it can be identified. A miracle is identified in one of two ways, either as an unusual event in nature or as an exception to nature. But he went on to say an unusual event in nature is simply a natural event, not a miracle, like an anomaly or something. He said an exception to nature cannot be known from nature alone. So when it comes to identifying a miracle, philosopher Stephen Davis says there's three criteria for suggesting or assessing whether a miracle remains a potential explanation. He says when the available naturalistic explanations fail and nothing else on the naturalistic horizon seems promising, then we could say a miracle's taken place. Or second, when the event has moral or religious significance, because a miracle would need to have moral and religious significance, or it's not a miracle. And then third, when the event in question is consistent with one's background beliefs about the desires and purposes of God as revealed in the religion to which one is committed. As far as defining a miracle, philosopher and apologist Francis Beckwith states a miracle is a divine intervention that occurs contrary to the religious course of nature within a significant historical and religious context. And so remember that all miracles do need a moral and religious context to them. There needs to be a historical context. Therefore, things like trying to compare miracles with things like Loch Ness monster sightings or Bigfoot sightings or UFO sightings are not really comparable, because those things are not real. They don't have any major moral or religious significance as far as we know. Beckwith goes on to say divine intervention refers to the action of a non-natural agent. He says, second, that which occurs contrary to the regular course of nature refers to an event that overrides scientific laws that cannot reasonably be accounted for either by the actions of natural agents such as human beings, extraterrestrials, or by nature left to its own devices. So that is the way he defines a miracle. C.S. Lewis said the way he defines miracles he says, I use the word miracle to mean an interference with nature by a supernatural force. He says that in his book Miracles. Michael Licona, who is a well-known resurrection apologist whom I've had at Ohio State, says, I define miracle as an event in history for which natural explanations are inadequate, and propose that we may identify he proposes that the way we may identify a miracle is when the event is highly unlikely to have occurred, and given the circumstances or natural law, it occurred in an environmental context charged with religious significance. William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland say in their book Foundations for a Christian Worldview, Philosophical Foundations for Christian Worldview, they say here that miracles are naturally impossible events. But then along comes Alvin Plantinga, who's a well-known Christian philosopher, and he kind of gives a different viewpoint on what miracles are. He doesn't think that there needs to be a serious divide between nature and supernatural. He says here, according to serious theism, God is already and always intending acting in nature, which depends from moment to moment for his existence upon immediate divine activity. There isn't and couldn't be any such thing as his intervening in nature. So, different philosophers and apologists have different definitions of miracles. It just depends which one you think makes the most sense. There's no doubt in Christian theology we believe that God is upholding nature on a moment-by-moment basis. However, some of these definitions think that God at times can do a special intervention into the world of nature. Of course, Plantinga doesn't agree with that definition here. Now, when it comes to defining a miracle, just for the average person, sometimes they get these confused. For example, you may be watching a sport event. For example, if you're watching a basketball game and you say Reggie Miller scores 9 points in the last 11 seconds to win a playoff game is a miracle. Sometimes they used to say the 1969 Miracle Mets were an example of a miracle. Or a man rescued after 28 days in the rubble in Haiti is a miracle. Or some people say their lives have been transformed by God, and that counts as a miracle as well. Somebody might shout it's a miracle when they win the lottery, a rare event that can't be explained by coincidence or chance. They may say that's a miracle. But some of these really fall short. We need to remember the difference between miracle and providence. Providence is not necessarily the same thing as a miracle, so I would view winning the lottery as more of a providential issue. That is, if you're attributing it to God. Some people say a baby being born is a miracle, but that is not really a rare event. It is an amazing event, but it's not necessarily a rare event because miracles are rare events. Remember these 5 points here. If people accept these, then obviously miracles are not going to be rejected from the beginning or starting point. Number one, if a theistic God exists, then miracles are possible. Secondly, a miracle is a special act of God. Third, God is the source of standard of truth. He cannot err. Therefore, true miracles in connection with the message confirm the message to be from a prophet of God. And then, of course, everything we see in the Bible shows new revelation needs new confirmation. Every time God was giving new revelation in the Bible, he confirmed it through a prophet. In every period of history, God would do that with a specific messenger. So if you look in the period of Israel's history, you look up through the period of the New Testament, God was always confirming new revelation through a prophet, whether it be Moses, Elijah, or Jesus himself, or the apostles. Now, this is kind of like an outline of classical apologetics. Many people obviously sometimes start with the Bible. They start at the very top with the historicity of the Bible. Sometimes that can be a challenge to start with the Bible, because if someone doesn't believe in the existence of God, or they don't believe in miracles, it can be hard to argue for the miracles in the Bible. So classical apologetics starts with the middle part here, the second bullet point, the existence and attributes of God. They start with natural theology, and then they work their way into the world of history, whereas historical apologetics just starts with the Bible itself, and they start to argue for the reliability of the New Testament and then arguing for the resurrection. So these are different apologetic approaches in relation to miracles, because the classical apologist thinks once you establish the existence of God, miracles are not going to be as hard to defend, obviously. So, as I said before, this is the evidential approach, historical approach. This is what people do with the resurrection, such as resurrection apologists. They start right with the Bible. And of course, that's a little bit different than the classical method. The classical method starts outside the Bible and works their way into the Bible. Now, there's no doubt that worldviews play a huge role in how people view miracles. In the pre-modern worldview, everybody believed in the existence of God, or most people did, and then you came into the modern Enlightenment period, where naturalism and science became the prominent way of knowing things. And obviously, the supernatural or the miraculous was put in the backside there, and many people begin to think science is the only way of knowing things. And of course, many people are still in that mindset today. And then, of course, you come to the postmodern period, where people are open to the supernatural, but they're very mystical or relative or pragmatic. And they're kind of like, well, you know, if it works for you, makes you happy, that's all that matters. So they're not necessarily against the supernatural, but they don't put a lot of confidence in one way of knowing things. They think to say science is the only way of knowing things is dangerous. So many people are in a mix today between the modern Enlightenment view and the postmodern view of reality. So we don't want to try to group people in one category. Now, we know that all of us have a worldview, but what we need to do is realize that a couple worldviews are out there on a regular basis, and one of them, of course, is naturalism. And naturalism is a philosophical worldview that says that physical matter is all that exists, that there are no non-physical things like souls or spirits or gods or God. No natural laws are ever violated accordingly, and everything that occurs can be, in principle, be explained by scientific methods, and that there are no miracles or permanent anomalies or mysteries. And so that's kind of a hardcore naturalistic worldview of reality, where in contrast, a theistic worldview says the physical world exists because God brought it into existence. Second, the world does exhibit certain natural laws, but they only hold because God has established them. Third, God has the ability, perhaps occasionally the intention, to bring about events that otherwise, apart from God's intention, would not have occurred. And then fourth, accordingly, not all events can in principle be explained naturalistically. Some events can be explained by the direct action of God. So these two worldviews are definitely still play a large role in the culture around us. Many people do have a naturalistic worldview, but many people still have a theistic worldview. So obviously, these two worldviews see reality differently. Now, obviously, within the Bible, there is no natural, supernatural distinction. Biblical authors don't necessarily make that distinction. They don't look at something that happened and say, that's natural or supernatural. They believe all the events are caused by God, caused directly by God. For example, you look at the parting of the Red Sea, they believe it was caused by a strong east wind blowing all night. So they could just say that God was behind the world of nature, that he upheld nature, or he was sustaining nature on a regular basis. And so they didn't really have that distinction. That distinction between natural and supernatural came around during the Enlightenment period, and many people use that today. We need to remember the different categories. We don't want to necessarily assume miracles are the same thing as anomalies. Anomalies are definitely rare events, or they're freaks of nature, I should say. But they're not necessarily the same thing as miracles. Miracles are not the same thing as magic. magic or psychosomatic things in the mind. Definitely in the Bible, they're not the same thing as satanic signs. Obviously, Satan in the Bible, we see him counterfeiting what God does and trying to imitate God's miracles. Miracles are not the same thing as providence. Like I said, if you pray for a $50 bill, today you need $50 and you find a $50 bill on the side of the road, it doesn't necessarily mean that's a miracle. That would be considered providence. Miracles are an act of God. They always last. They're immediate. They always bring glory to God, as we see on the far right. They're done to bring honor and glory to God, and they always happen within a moral and religious context. And as I said before, they're rare events. They do not happen on a regular basis. If they happen on a regular basis, they wouldn't be miracles. So as I said, biblical miracles are immediate. For example, with the healing ministry of Jesus, we see that when he healed people, they were healed immediately. We see that in Acts 3 in Peter's ministry, that God healed the person immediately. So generally the miracles are not long and drawn out. They happen immediately. We know they're not done for entertainment. We see in the Bible that miracles are done with a distinct purpose to glorify God and directing men to him. They also have a moral dimension. They bring glory to God by manifesting his moral character. We know that through miracles, as I said, God confirms his true people as true prophets for him. As I said, we see this pattern throughout the Bible in the life of Moses, Elijah, Jesus, and the apostles, where God would confirm new revelation through a prophet. That seems to be the pattern all throughout history, but we know the prophets end within the Bible. There's no new revelation to humanity once Jesus came. He is God's final revelation to humanity, and the canon's closed. There are no supernatural prophets today or prophets that are bringing new revelation to humanity. Of course, people think there is, and that's why we have 50,000 different cults today, such as Mormonism and the Watchtower Society and Islam as well. So we see here when God confirmed a true prophet, when God confirmed Moses as a true prophet, Moses said to God, "What if they do not listen to me or believe me?" The Lord gives Moses two signs. His rod turns into a snake and his hand became leprous. That was a sign to show Moses was a true prophet. And within the New Testament, there's three terms we tend to translate miracle in English. There's sign, wonder, and act of power. Simeon, teros, and dunamis. We see in Acts 2:22 that Jesus was a man accredited to God by miracles, wonders, and signs. So those are generally the three words or three terms we use to translate into miracle in the Bible. And as I said, there's different time periods of miracles in the Bible. We had the Mosaic period. That's from the Exodus through the taking of the Promised Land. We have the prophetic period. That is the ministry of Elijah and others we see. And we also see that Isaiah spoke of a time where someone would come and bring spiritual and physical deliverance to Israel. And of course, we have the apostolic period, and that is at the time of Jesus and with the first apostles, that there were miracles that were taking place. But then after that, it seems that we don't have any new prophets or new revelation. As I said, we know miracles are not anomalies in nature. We know that miracles must not be confused with a natural anomaly like a lunar eclipse. We know that miracles are not naturally repeatable. Anomalies are repeatable or predictable. For example, the flight of a bumblebee was an anomaly for many years, but since it occurred regularly, it was predictable even before it was explainable. We know that anomalies lack the theological, moral, and theological dimensions of miracles. And so we don't want to confuse miracles with anomalies. That does happen quite frequently. Miracles are not the same thing as magic, as I said. Magic tricks involve innocent deception, but miracles involve no deception. Magic has a purely natural explanation. Miracles do not. A miracle is under God's control, or magic is under human control. Generally, occult magic brings glory to the magician and psychosomatic cures to the one who performs them, but miracles always bring glory to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, when it comes to history, we know that three theistic faiths are Judaism, Christianity, Messianic Judaism, and Islam. These ones on the far right are not theistic. Some of them are polytheistic or pantheistic. That means we need to ask where in history God has spoken to confirm who he is. That means, did he speak in history somewhere where he showed his miraculous action? And of course, that's what we do. We ask, when has God revealed himself in human history, and where has he revealed himself in human history? Now, we know that when you study different world religions, they all contradict each other at some level. And of course, we believe that God has spoken through historical revelation, that being, of course, the work of Jesus and his resurrection. And so if you're open to looking into history to see if God has spoken, I encourage you to look at the evidence for the death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. A few more common objections that come up to miracles is from the objection from science. Scientists generally say that they cannot give up looking for a naturalistic explanation for every event. To admit that a miracle has happened is to give up looking for a naturalistic explanation. Third, therefore, to admit miracles is to give up being a scientist. Since science is the study of the natural world, obviously that's fine. They can look for naturalistic explanations, but we need to look at other explanations to reality. And so if we look at history and philosophy, those are other things we can use to find the existence of God. So science is fine, but science is restricted to looking for naturalistic causation. As I said, science is a study of the natural world. God, by definition, transcends the natural world. But we do believe God can use nature as a mechanism to accomplish his purpose if he wants to. So just because science and scientists can study the mechanism as how things work in the natural world, that doesn't mean there's no agent behind the mechanism. And then, of course, this syllogism, miracles by definition violate natural laws. Secondly, natural laws are uniform. Third, miracles never occur. This is something that Hume put forward. And here we see the circular reasoning of it, because to say miracles don't occur because nature is uniform is to beg the question, because how do you know nature is uniform? And then if you assume nature is uniform, you obviously reject every possible miracle report that's out there. But once again, we see the circularity of this argument. In Stephen Hawking's book, The Grand Design, he said here this book is rooted in the concept of scientific determinism, which implies there are no miracles or exceptions to the laws of nature. Once again, this is a philosophical assertion, not a scientific conclusion. We see Hawking's philosophy here. It's not science, because he's already ruling out the possibility of miracles to begin with, and that's a philosophical statement he's making. Then, of course, we have David Hume's argument that is still used quite regularly. He said natural law is by definition a description of a regular occurrence. A miracle is by definition a rare occurrence. The evidence for the regular is always greater than that for the rare. Fourth, the wise man always bases his belief on the greater evidence. Therefore, he says in conclusion, therefore, a wise man should never believe in miracles. Of course, this argument is ridiculous because the evidence for regular events is not always greater than that for the rare, because there's all kinds of rare events throughout history and science. So if we reject every rare event, we'd have to reject the beginning of the universe. We'd have to reject how life came on Earth or got started on Earth. We know the history is filled with many rare events, and the entire history of the Earth cannot be repeated. So to say we only accept the regular and not the rare doesn't make a whole lot of sense. We wouldn't know much in science if we can only accept repeatable events, because many things are rare events. They're singularities. So that argument from Hume doesn't work. Another argument he gives here is all non-Christian religions are supported by similar miracle claims in both their nature and the eyewitness testimony. He says, number 2, but no such miracles have strong enough testimony to maintain evidential value, so they're self-canceling. In conclusion, he says no non-Christian religion is supported by miracles. So he's basically saying all the different religions out there cancel each other out because they all have eyewitness testimony, they all claim to have miracles, but because of the nature of the claim and the witnesses, and the issue of the evidential value of each claim. You can't put one above the other. He says they all really just cancel each other out. There's a problem with that, of course, because we know we can take each miracle claim on a case-by-case basis. And if you study world religions, you know that not every miracle claim has the same amount of evidential value. You have to look at the eyewitnesses to see if they're they have credible testimony and whether they're telling the truth. So just to say they all cancel each other out is really an oversimplification. That's why in each faith and each religious claim or each miracle claim, you need to ask 3 questions. What does it claim to know? How does it claim to know it? And what is the evidence for it? For example, you would say our claim in the biblical claim is that Jesus died and rose from the dead. How do we claim to know that? We know that through historical evidence and through religious experience. And then third, what is the evidence for it? Then we would go through the reliability and the test of historicity of the New Testament, and likewise do the same for the resurrection. Another argument that's out there sometimes is used by this gentleman here, Ernst Troeltsch. He was a sociologist who lived 1865 to 1923. But he said, since if we don't have any contemporary experience of the resurrection of a dead person, we have good reasons for believing that no dead man has ever been raised. So basically what he says, the past can only be known only in terms of what happens in the present. So therefore, if you don't see something repeated in the present, it couldn't have happened in the past. And so from his perspective, if you don't see people rising from the dead today, it's not a regular occurrence or can't be repeated in the present. That means it didn't happen in the past. And of course, this argument is ridiculous as well, because if we only believe things that happened in the past because they're happening on a regular basis in today's world, once again, we'd end up rejecting several things from the past. The beginning of life and the start of the universe are unique, one-time, unrepeatable events. And we know, as I said before, that science deals with things that are not repeatable today. They study singularities. Same thing with history. There's many singularities that are not repeatable. So his argument is similar to Hume's in one way, and they both have serious problems to them. But many people use them to this day in how they try to argue against miracles in the Bible or else the resurrection of Jesus. So I hope that helps you with your thinking or your apologetic value of miracles, and I hope you can use this in your discussion with others. Thank you.